The morning mist clung to the abandoned highway like a shroud, obscuring the shambling forms that moved through it with relentless purpose. Kalen Thorne pressed the binoculars against his weathered face, counting the silhouettes that emerged from the gray veil. His jaw tightened as the numbers climbed higher than any horde they had encountered in their 3 years at Sanctuary Ridge. "How many?" Senna Brightwood asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The archer's keen eyes tracked the movement below, her hand instinctively checking the quiver of steel-tipped arrows at her hip. "Too many," Kalen replied, lowering the binoculars. His scarred hands, marked by countless battles against the undead, trembled slightly. "Maybe 3,000. Could be more behind the tree line." Sanctuary Ridge had been their home since the world ended. What started as a desperate refuge for 47 survivors had grown into a fortified community of nearly 200 souls. They had chosen this location for its natural defenses, steep cliffs on 3 sides and a narrow approach that could be easily defended. But as Kalen watched the massive horde flowing like a dark river toward their gates, he wondered if their preparations would be enough. Darius Ashmont wiped grease from his hands as he emerged from the generator shed, his engineer's mind already calculating their defensive capabilities. The tall, lean man had spent the last year reinforcing their walls with steel plating salvaged from nearby factories. His innovations had saved them before, but this felt different. This felt final. "The motion sensors picked up movement 2 miles out," he reported, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "They'll reach the outer perimeter by nightfall." Lyra Nightfall looked up from the medical supplies she was organizing in the courtyard. Her auburn hair caught the morning light as she moved with practiced efficiency between the wounded from their latest supply run. As the settlement's head medic, she had seen more death than anyone her age should bear. The haunted look in her green eyes spoke of losses that still kept her awake at night. "We have enough supplies for maybe 50 wounded," she said, her voice carrying the weight of inevitable choices. "If this goes badly, I'll have to prioritize who gets treatment." Vesper Cross, barely 19 but possessing a tactical mind that impressed even Kalen, studied the crude map they had drawn of the surrounding area. Her fingers traced potential retreat routes and defensive positions, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Despite her youth, she had proven herself invaluable in previous engagements, her unconventional strategies often turning desperate situations into victories. "They're not following normal migration patterns," she observed, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Something drove them here specifically. This isn't random." Ronan Steele spat into the dirt and hefted his modified sledgehammer. The grizzled veteran had fought in wars before the world ended, and his experience with both human and undead enemies made him their most feared warrior. His gray beard was stained with tobacco, and his eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had made peace with violence. "Don't matter why they're here," he growled. "Only matters that we send them back to hell where they belong." As the leadership gathered in the reinforced command center, Kalen felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. These people had chosen to follow him, to trust his decisions with their lives and the lives of their children. The settlement buzzed with activity as families secured their homes and fighters checked their weapons, but underneath the purposeful movement lay an undercurrent of fear. Through the reinforced windows, they could see the distant treeline where scouts reported the horde gathering. The undead moved with a coordination that defied their individual mindlessness, flowing around obstacles like water finding the path of least resistance. Some wore the tattered remains of military uniforms, others the casual clothes of suburban families, all united now in their hunger for living flesh. Senna climbed the watchtower that Darius had constructed at the settlement's highest point. From here she could see the full scope of what approached them. The horde stretched back beyond her vision, a sea of rotting humanity that had somehow found purpose in death. She had faced down charging infected, outmaneuvered roving gangs of desperate survivors, and led successful raids on abandoned cities, but this felt different. This felt like Judgment Day. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the mist, the true magnitude of their situation became clear. This wouldn't be just another siege to weather or battle to win. This would be the test that determined whether Sanctuary Ridge would stand as a beacon of human resilience or fall like so many other settlements before it. The mindless walkers below possessed no strategy beyond hunger, but their sheer numbers might be enough to overwhelm even the smartest survivors. The epic showdown was about to begin. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Sanctuary Ridge as its defenders made their final preparations. Kalen moved through the settlement like a man possessed, checking defensive positions and offering words of encouragement to fighters who looked far younger than their years. The weight of leadership had carved deep lines around his eyes, but his voice remained steady as he coordinated their response to the approaching nightmare. Darius worked frantically in his workshop, welding additional spikes to the outer barriers while his apprentices distributed homemade explosives to key defensive points. The engineer had spent months perfecting his designs, creating improvised weapons from scavenged materials. His latest innovation, a series of triggered pit traps filled with sharpened rebar, formed a deadly maze approaching their main gate. "The charges are set," he reported to Kalen, his hands blackened with soot and his eyes red from sleepless nights. "If they mass against the outer wall, we can funnel them into the kill zones. But once those are spent, we're down to conventional weapons." Senna had taken position on the wall's highest rampart, her modified compound bow in hand and her quiver loaded with armor-piercing arrows she had crafted herself. From her vantage point, she could see the Horde's advance guard emerging from the forest. They moved with the relentless patience of the dead, unaffected by the heat that already exhausted the living defenders. "First contact in 2 hours," she called down to the courtyard. "They're not rushing. They know we have nowhere to run." Vesper had transformed the command center into a tactical nerve center, with runners ready to carry orders to different sections of the wall. Her youth belied the sharp intelligence behind her calculations, and she had identified 17 different scenarios for how the battle might unfold. Unfortunately, most of them ended with the settlement overrun. "We need to break their momentum early," she advised Kalen. "If they establish a foothold against the wall, their numbers will overwhelm us through sheer pressure. Hit them hard at the outer perimeter, then fall back to prepared positions." Lyra had converted the settlement's meeting hall into a field hospital, her medical supplies arranged with military precision. Volunteers with basic first aid training stood ready to assist, their faces pale but determined. She had already made the hardest decisions about who would receive priority treatment, weighing the tactical value of each fighter against the moral weight of letting others die. In the hours before battle, personal moments took on heightened significance. Senna found herself thinking of her younger brother, lost in the early days of the outbreak when she had been forced to choose between saving him and saving herself. Darius touched the photograph in his pocket, a picture of the family he had lost to raiders 2 years ago. Lyra's hands shook slightly as she prepared morphine injections, remembering the field hospital where she had watched her mentor die from infected bites. Ronan gathered the settlement's fighters in the armory, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had survived more battles than most could imagine. These weren't soldiers. They were teachers, mechanics, farmers, and shopkeepers who had learned to fight because the alternative was death. But they had chosen to make their stand here, and that counted for something. "Some of you are scared," he told them, his eyes meeting each of theirs in turn. "Good. Fear keeps you alive. But remember what we're fighting for. Every child sleeping in those houses, every friend standing beside you, every day of normal life we've built here. The dead want to take that from us, and we're not going to let them." As evening approached, the temperature began to drop, but the approaching horde generated its own heat, the collective warmth of thousands of bodies pressed together in their inexorable advance. The sound reached them first, a low moaning that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself, punctuated by the shuffle of countless feet and the occasional crash as the undead trampled obstacles in their path. Kalen made his final rounds, checking each defensive position and ensuring that ammunition was distributed to where it would be most effective. The settlement's children had been moved to the most secure building, a reinforced structure that could serve as a final refuge if the walls were breached. The thought of what would happen to them if the defenses failed drove every decision he made. The outer perimeter sensors began triggering in sequence, electronic warnings that the horde had reached their first line of defense. Darius had rigged motion detectors to floodlights that would reveal the enemy's positions while temporarily blinding their light-sensitive eyes. But those advantages would last only minutes before the sheer mass of bodies overwhelmed the carefully planned obstacles. Vesper coordinated the retreat of the outer scouts, ensuring that every defender made it back to the walls before the trap was sprung. Her radio crackled with position reports and ammunition counts, a steady stream of information that she processed with mechanical efficiency. The young strategist had learned to compartmentalize fear, focusing on tactical considerations rather than the human cost of her decisions. As darkness fell, the settlement's defenders took their positions along the walls. Floodlights illuminated the approaches, creating stark shadows that danced with the movement of the approaching dead. The horde had grown larger as scattered groups of infected joined the main mass, drawn by some signal that the living couldn't perceive. Standing on the wall beside his friends and neighbors, Kalen felt the peculiar calm that preceded every major battle. Their preparations were complete, their weapons were loaded, and their resolve was tested. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just their fate, but the future of human resistance in this corner of the broken world. The epic showdown was about to begin in earnest. The floodlights blazed to life as motion sensors detected the leading edge of the horde, transforming night into artificial day across the killing field that surrounded Sanctuary Ridge. What the light revealed sent a chill through even the most hardened defenders, a sea of rotting faces and reaching hands that stretched back beyond the illuminated zone, all focused with terrifying single-mindedness on the settlement's walls. Senna drew her bowstring taut, her first arrow aimed at a former police officer whose uniform hung in tatters from his decomposing frame. The shot took him in the eye socket, dropping him instantly, but 3 more undead simply trampled his body without pause. She knocked another arrow, finding the rhythm that had kept her alive through countless encounters with the infected. "Here they come," Ronan bellowed from the center of the line, his modified sledgehammer gleaming under the floodlights. The veteran had seen human wave attacks before, but nothing quite like this. The dead felt no fear, experienced no hesitation, and showed no concern for the casualties mounting around them. Darius triggered the first set of explosive charges as the horde's leading elements reached the outer obstacles. The detonation lit up the night, sending bodies flying in all directions and leaving a crater filled with dismembered corpses. But the pause lasted only seconds before the next wave flowed around the obstacle, using their fallen comrades as stepping stones over the debris. The pit traps claimed dozens of victims, their sharpened stakes piercing rotting flesh and pinning the undead in place. But even impaled and immobilized, the creatures continued their relentless attempts to reach the living, clawing at the trap walls until their fingers wore down to bone. Behind them, hundreds more pressed forward, eventually filling the pits with enough bodies to create bridges for those that followed. Vesper coordinated the defense from the command center, her radio crackling with position reports and ammunition expenditure rates. The young strategist had anticipated this initial assault, but the horde's sheer size exceeded even her worst-case calculations. Her carefully planned kill zones were being overwhelmed through simple mathematical pressure. "Concentrate fire on the left flank," she ordered through her headset. "They're massing for a push against the generator shed." Lyra worked desperately in her improvised hospital as the first casualties arrived. A young defender named Marcus had taken shrapnel from one of Darius's explosions, and an older woman called Elena bore deep scratches from an infected that had nearly cleared the outer wall. The medic's hands moved with practiced efficiency, but she could already see that her supply estimates had been optimistic. The sound of the battle was overwhelming, the constant crack of rifles, the wet thud of melee weapons finding their marks, and underneath it all, the endless moaning of the horde. The dead felt no pain, experienced no fatigue, and showed no signs of retreat even as their numbers were steadily reduced by the defenders' fire. Kalen moved along the wall, his assault rifle chattering as he engaged clusters of infected that threatened to overwhelm individual defenders. His leadership style had always been to lead from the front, and tonight was no exception. A massive infected in a construction worker's hard hat had managed to grab the lip of the wall, hauling itself upward with surprising strength for something that had been dead for months. The settlement's leader put 3 rounds center mass into the creature's torso, but it continued climbing until Ronan appeared beside him, bringing his sledgehammer down on the infected skull with bone-crushing force. The body fell back into the horde, taking 2 other climbers with it. "They're learning," Senna called out as she switched to her backup quiver. "The ones behind are watching how we defend and adapting their approach." It was true. While individual infected showed no intelligence, the horde as a whole seemed to be developing crude tactics. They began using larger corpses as shields while smaller ones attempted to climb, and groups of infected started coordinating their assaults on weak points in the defensive line. Darius detonated his remaining charges in sequence, each explosion buying them precious seconds as the horde reorganized around the new obstacles. But his ammunition was finite, and the enemy seemed infinite. The engineer's carefully prepared defenses were being consumed faster than he had anticipated, leaving them increasingly dependent on small arms fire and melee combat. The first serious breach came at the settlement's eastern wall, where a section of reinforcement had been damaged in a previous raid. 3 infected managed to haul themselves over the rampart before the defenders could react, immediately lunging for the nearest living targets. A teenager named Cora fought desperately with a crowbar, managing to crush one attacker's skull before the other 2 overwhelmed her position. Ronan arrived like a force of nature, his sledgehammer clearing the breach with devastating efficiency. But Cora was bleeding heavily from bite wounds on her arm and shoulder. Lyra's voice crackled over the radio, calling for immediate evacuation to the medical station, but everyone understood what bite wounds meant in their world. As the first wave of the assault continued, the defenders began to grasp the true scope of their challenge. This wasn't just another raid or siege, this was an extinction event. The horde pressed against their defenses with the patience of geological forces, wearing down their resistance through sheer attrition. Vesper updated her tactical assessments as new information flowed in. Ammunition expenditure was exceeding projections, several key defensive positions were already compromised, and the enemy showed no signs of fatigue or retreat. Her calculations suggested they might survive the night, but barely and only if nothing went wrong. Unfortunately, as any veteran of combat could tell her, everything always went wrong. The floodlights began to flicker as the generator strained under the increased electrical load, and Darius received reports that several of his motion sensors had been destroyed by the explosions he had triggered. Their technological advantages were being systematically eliminated, leaving them increasingly dependent on human courage and determination. As the first wave of the assault reached its crescendo, each defender faced a simple truth: they were vastly outnumbered by an enemy that felt no fear, experienced no pain, and would never retreat. Their only advantages were intelligence, preparation, and the desperate determination of people fighting for everything they held dear. The real test was just beginning. Dawn broke gray and hostile over Sanctuary Ridge, revealing the true carnage of the night's battle. The outer defensive perimeter lay in ruins, littered with hundreds of dismembered corpses and the twisted remains of Darius's carefully constructed obstacles. But for every fallen infected, it seemed 3 more had taken its place, and the horde continued its relentless pressure against the settlement's increasingly battered walls. Kalen surveyed the battlefield through bloodshot eyes, his rifle barrel so hot from continuous firing that it had begun to warp slightly. The settlement's ammunition supplies, carefully hoarded over 3 years, had been depleted by nearly half in a single night. At this rate, they would be reduced to melee weapons by the following evening. "We need to change tactics," Vesper announced during the brief lull that preceded dawn. Her tactical center had become a hurricane of activity, with runners carrying messages between defensive positions and radio operators struggling to maintain communication through increasing interference. "The attrition approach isn't sustainable. We're being bled dry." Senna had already adapted her strategy, switching from precision shots to area denial techniques. Her arrows now carried improvised incendiary heads that Darius had fashioned from cleaning supplies and alcohol. The fires they created wouldn't stop the infected, but they created barriers that funneled the horde into predetermined kill zones. "Fireworks for about 10 minutes, she reported, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation. "Then they just walk through the flames. The smell is horrible, but it doesn't slow them down." The most troubling development was the horde's apparent ability to learn from previous assaults. Groups of infected now approached with crude coordination, using destroyed vehicles and debris as improvised shields. Some even demonstrated rudimentary tool use, picking up rocks and pieces of metal to hurl at the defenders. Lyra's medical station had become a scene from a nightmare. 17 wounded defenders filled every available space, and she had already been forced to make 3 impossible decisions about who would receive her limited supplies of antibiotics. The bite victims were isolated in a separate room, where they waited for the inevitable transformation that would force their friends to end their suffering. Cora, the teenager who had been bitten during the night assault, asked to speak with Kalen. Her arm was already showing the telltale black veins that marked the spread of infection, and her fever was climbing steadily. She had perhaps 2 hours before the transformation began. "Don't let them get to the children's shelter," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. "Promise me that whatever happens you won't let them reach the kids." Ronan had taken command of the eastern wall, where the night's breach had created a weak point that the horde continued to probe. His sledgehammer had been replaced with a machete and pistol combination that allowed for faster engagement times, but even his legendary endurance was beginning to show signs of strain. "Lost count after the 300th kill," he muttered to Darius, who was attempting to reinforce the damaged wall section with salvaged steel plating. "Starting to wonder if there's enough bullets in the world for all of them." Darius had been forced to cannibalize equipment from throughout the settlement to maintain their defensive systems. The floodlights now operated on rotating schedules to preserve generator fuel, and many of his electronic sensors had been destroyed by the constant bombardment of thrown debris. His engineering innovations were being systematically eliminated by the horde's crude but effective tactics. The psychological pressure was perhaps worse than the physical assault. The constant moaning of the infected created a sound that seemed to penetrate bone and soul, while the sight of so many animated corpses challenged fundamental assumptions about death and human dignity. Several defenders had already suffered mental breaks, requiring sedation or restraint to prevent them from compromising the defense. Vesper's tactical models had evolved throughout the night, but every projection led to the same conclusion. They were fighting a losing battle of attrition. The Horde's numbers seemed infinite, while their resources were demonstrably finite. Unless something changed dramatically, Sanctuary Ridge would fall within the next 24 hours. "We need to consider evacuation protocols," she advised Kalen during their midday conference. "The children and non-combatants could be moved through the back passages while we hold the line. Some of us might survive if we abandon the settlement." The suggestion sparked heated debate among the leadership. This had been their home for 3 years, built through blood, sweat, and countless sacrifices. The idea of abandoning it to the Horde felt like betraying everyone who had died defending it. But the alternative might be the complete extinction of their community. Senna had begun experiencing hallucinations from exhaustion and stress, occasionally mistaking shadows for infected attackers. Her legendary accuracy was declining as fatigue set in, and she had already requested permission to take stimulants from Lyra's medical supplies. The archer who had never missed a crucial shot was beginning to doubt her abilities at the moment when they needed her most. The Horde had begun employing new tactics as well. Groups of infected now worked together to undermine specific sections of the wall, while others created human pyramids to reach previously safe positions. Their coordination suggested some form of collective intelligence that no one had anticipated in their defensive planning. As afternoon wore on, the defenders faced a series of cascading system failures. The generator began showing signs of mechanical stress, several key radio frequencies were jammed by unknown interference, and their water filtration system had been damaged by debris thrown by the infected. The infrastructure that supported their survival was being systematically degraded. Lyra made the hardest decision of her medical career when she authorized the use of their remaining morphine to provide peaceful endings for the bite victims. Cora was the first, her hand clasped in Lyra's as the young medic administered the fatal dose. The teenager's last words were a request for someone to remember her name. As evening approached once again, the defenders of Sanctuary Ridge faced a stark reality. They had survived one night, but barely. Their ammunition was critically low, their defenses were compromised, and their morale was cracking under the relentless pressure. The Horde showed no signs of fatigue or retreat, and if anything seemed to be growing larger as scattered groups of infected joined the assault. Kalen stood on the wall as darkness fell once again, looking out at the sea of undead faces illuminated by their failing floodlights. Somewhere in that mass of rotting humanity were people he had known, neighbors, friends, perhaps even family members transformed into mindless predators. The thought that he might soon join them was becoming harder to dismiss. The second night of the siege was about to begin, and everyone understood that it might well be their last. The second night brought with it a calculated fury that dwarfed the previous evening's chaos. The Horde had spent the daylight hours organizing itself into a more efficient killing machine, and as darkness fell, the assault began with a coordination that defied everything the defenders thought they knew about the infected. Kalen watched in horror as the mass of undead split into 3 distinct columns, each targeting a different section of the settlement's wall simultaneously. The random shambling of individual infected had been replaced by something approaching military tactics, suggesting a level of collective intelligence that made his blood run cold. "They're flanking us," Vesper reported through the radio, her voice tight with disbelief. "The main assault is hitting the south wall while secondary forces probe the east and west defenses. It's like they're testing for weak points." Senna had positioned herself at the highest watchtower, where she could provide supporting fire for all 3 defensive positions. But even her enhanced vantage point couldn't cover the entire perimeter, and she was forced to make split-second decisions about where her arrows would have the greatest impact. Each shot had to count now as their ammunition reserves dwindled toward zero. The south wall, reinforced with Darius's best engineering work, became the focal point of the main assault. Hundreds of infected pressed against the barrier with such force that the steel plating began to buckle and groan. Behind them, more undead climbed over their fallen comrades, creating a literal mountain of bodies that grew higher with each passing minute. Ronan commanded the desperate defense of the south wall, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over the cacophony of battle. The veteran warrior had abandoned his favorite sledgehammer for an assault rifle with a bayonet attachment, the better to engage multiple targets in rapid succession. But even his legendary skill was being tested by the sheer volume of enemies pressing against their position. "They're using the bodies as ramps," he called out to anyone who could hear. "The pile's getting high enough for them to reach the ramparts. We need those explosives now." Darius triggered his remaining charges with surgical precision, each detonation calculated to disrupt the growing pile of corpses without compromising the wall's structural integrity. The explosion sent body parts flying in all directions, temporarily clearing the immediate threat, but more infected immediately moved to fill the gaps. The eastern wall faced a different type of assault as smaller groups of infected attempted to scale the defenses using improvised tools and coordinated climbing techniques. These attacks were repelled repeatedly, but each successful defense cost precious ammunition and left the defenders more exhausted. Fatigue was becoming as dangerous as the enemy themselves. Lyra worked frantically in her field hospital as casualties mounted throughout the night. Her supplies were nearly exhausted, and she had been forced to perform emergency amputations on 3 defenders who had suffered severe bite wounds. The screams of the wounded competed with the moaning of the horde, creating a symphony of suffering that threatened to break the sanity of everyone who heard it. The western wall held longest, protected by natural rock formations that made climbing difficult even for the coordinated infected. But as the night wore on, the horde began using the bodies of their fallen comrades to fill in gaps and create access routes. What had once been impassable terrain was slowly being transformed into a highway for the undead. Vesper's tactical center had become a chaos of conflicting reports and impossible decisions. Every position was under pressure, ammunition was critically low across all sectors, and several key defenders had been lost to injury or mental breakdown. Her projections showed complete defensive collapse within hours unless something dramatic changed. "We need to consider the unthinkable," she told Kaelin during a brief lull in the assault. "Controlled retreat to the central compound, seal the blast doors and hope the reinforced bunker can hold until help arrives." The suggestion sparked immediate debate among the remaining leadership. The central compound could hold perhaps 50 people for a few days, but it meant abandoning the rest of the settlement to the horde. Worse, there was no help coming. They were the last organized resistance for hundreds of miles in any direction. Senna's position in the watchtower came under direct assault as infected began using thrown debris to target her sniper's nest. A chunk of concrete struck her shoulder, sending her tumbling from her perch to a lower platform. Her bow was damaged in the fall, leaving her with only a sidearm and a handful of rounds. The loss of their overwatch position was catastrophic. Without Senna's covering fire, several defensive positions were immediately overrun. The infected poured through gaps in the line like water through a broken dam, and hand-to-hand fighting erupted throughout the settlement's outer areas. Ronan made the decision that would define the rest of the battle. Rather than allow the infected to establish a foothold within the settlement, he led a desperate counterattack designed to push them back beyond the walls. Armed with nothing but melee weapons and determination, a dozen volunteers followed him into the heart of the horde. The assault was suicidal but effective. Ronan's sledgehammer, retrieved from his earlier position, cleared a corridor through the infected mass while his volunteers protected his flanks with improvised spears and machetes. They fought with the fury of people who had nothing left to lose, and for a brief moment, the horde's advance was actually reversed. But the victory was temporary and costly. Half of Ronan's volunteers were overwhelmed and killed, their sacrifice buying perhaps 10 minutes of breathing room for the remaining defenders. The veteran warrior himself bore deep scratches across his arms and face, wounds that might prove fatal in a world where any break in the skin could mean infection and death. Darius made the hardest decision of his engineering career. The settlement's generator, which had powered their defenses throughout the siege, was rigged with enough explosives to level half the complex. If the walls fell completely, the resulting detonation would take hundreds of infected with it, but it would also destroy everything they had built. As the second night reached its climax, the defenders of Sanctuary Ridge faced the reality that their fortress was failing. The walls that had protected them for 3 years were crumbling under assault, their ammunition was nearly exhausted, and their numbers had been reduced to a handful of wounded, exhausted survivors. The infected sensed victory approaching. Their moaning reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the settlement, and their assault intensified with renewed fury. Bodies piled against every wall, creating ramps that brought the horde ever closer to their final objective. In the command center, Vesper stared at her tactical displays with the detached calm of someone who had accepted the inevitable. The numbers were clear. They had perhaps 2 hours before complete defensive collapse, and after that, the children in the central bunker would be the only living humans left in Sanctuary Ridge. The epic showdown was approaching its climax, and everyone understood that dawn might find them all among the ranks of the undead. The third dawn broke blood-red over a settlement transformed into a charnel house. Bodies, both living and undead, filled every street and alleyway of Sanctuary Ridge, while the acrid smoke of burning fuel and flesh painted the sky in shades of despair. The outer walls had finally fallen during the darkest hours before sunrise, leaving only the central compound and its handful of defenders standing against the inexorable tide of the infected. Kalen counted their remaining forces with grim precision: 17 able-bodied fighters, 12 wounded who could still hold a weapon, and 38 non-combatants sealed in the reinforced bunker beneath the command center. Against them pressed the remnants of the horde, perhaps 1,000 infected that had survived the siege, their rotting faces pressed against the windows of the central compound with mindless hunger. "Generators running on fumes," Darius reported, his voice hollow with exhaustion. The engineer's hands were burned from handling explosives and hot metal, and his left arm hung useless from a shoulder wound that Lyra had barely managed to stop bleeding. Maybe 2 hours of power left, then we're down to emergency lighting. Senna crouched beside a shattered window, her damaged bow replaced with a scavenged pistol that held their last magazine of ammunition. The archer's legendary accuracy had been reduced to point-blank headshots as infected pressed against the building's exterior walls. Her right eye was swollen shut from debris, and her movement spoke of someone operating purely on adrenaline and will. Vesper's tactical center had been reduced to a single radio and a collection of hand-drawn maps, her sophisticated equipment destroyed when a group of infected had breached the communications room. The young strategist's mind still functioned with mechanical precision, but her calculations now dealt with minutes rather than hours, and every projection ended in the same inevitable conclusion. "They're massing for a final push," she reported to the assembled defenders. "The main doors won't hold much longer, and once they breach the lobby, we'll have maybe 10 minutes before they reach the bunker level." Ronan sat propped against a wall, his legendary sledgehammer across his knees and his chest bandaged where infected claws had nearly reached his heart. The veteran warrior's voice was a whisper, but his eyes still burned with defiant fury. 10 minutes is enough. Always said I wanted to go down swinging." Lyra moved between the wounded with her remaining medical supplies, offering what comfort she could to defenders who knew they were living their final hours. Her hands shook with exhaustion and grief, but she continued her work with the dedication of someone who understood that mercy was the last gift she could offer. The bite victims had been moved to a separate room, where they waited for transformation with whatever dignity remained to them. The sound of splintering would announce the failure of the main doors. Infected poured through the breach like a black tide, their moaning creating a sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The lobby, which had once welcomed visitors to their community, became a killing ground where the last defenders of humanity made their stand. Kalen led the defense from the center of the line, his assault rifle chattering until the bolt locked back on an empty chamber. He drew his sidearm with smooth precision, each shot carefully aimed to conserve their final rounds of ammunition. Around him, friends and neighbors fell one by one, their sacrifice buying precious seconds for those who remained. The central staircase became a funnel of death as infected tried to reach the bunker level. Darius had rigged improvised explosives throughout the stairwell, each charge manually triggered to maximize casualties among the attacking horde. The engineer's burns made it agony to handle the detonator switches, but he endured the pain with stoic determination. Senna found herself defending the medical station as infected broke through the eastern windows. Her pistol ran dry after 4 shots, leaving her with nothing but a surgical scalpel against opponents who felt no pain. She fought with the desperate fury of someone protecting the wounded, but the outcome was never in doubt. Vesper continued coordinating the defense even as infected overran her position. Her radio crackled with final position reports and ammunition counts, a steady stream of information that painted a picture of heroic futility. The young strategist's last transmission was a warning to the bunker level. "They're through. Seal everything. Don't let them reach the children." Ronan's final stand became the stuff of legend, though few survived to tell it. The veteran warrior held the central corridor alone for nearly 5 minutes, his sledgehammer rising and falling with mechanical precision as bodies piled around his position. He fought until his strength failed and the infected overwhelmed him through sheer numbers, his defiant roar audible even through the compound's thick walls. Lyra made the hardest choice of her career in the medical station's final moments. Rather than allow the wounded to be consumed alive, she distributed her remaining morphine among those who could no longer fight. Her patients died peacefully in her arms as infected claws scraped against the barricaded door, and she saved the final dose for herself. Darius triggered his last explosive as infected reached the bunker level, the detonation collapsing part of the stairwell and temporarily blocking their advance. But even his engineering genius couldn't hold back the tide forever, and the sound of claws against steel announced that the barriers were failing one by one. Kalen found himself alone in the command center, his friends dead or transformed around him. The settlement's leader faced a final decision. He could open the bunker doors and lead the children in one last hopeless fight, or he could ensure their deaths were quick and merciful before the infected could reach them. The radio crackled with a weak signal from somewhere beyond the settlement. A voice, distorted by static but unmistakably human, called out coordinates and requested confirmation of survivors. Rescue was coming, but it would arrive hours too late for the defenders of Sanctuary Ridge. As infected finally breached the command center, Kalen made his choice. His hand moved to the master detonator that would trigger Darius's final explosive, the one rigged to the settlement's generator. The blast would level the entire compound, ensuring that the children would never experience the horror of transformation. In his final moments, the leader of Sanctuary Ridge felt no regret for his decision. They had fought with honor against impossible odds, and their sacrifice had meaning even in defeat. The infected would consume this settlement, but somewhere beyond the horizon, other communities would learn from their example and perhaps survive where they had fallen. The explosion lit up the dawn sky like a second sunrise, and when the light faded, Sanctuary Ridge existed only as a crater filled with the mingled remains of the living and the dead. The epic showdown was over, but its echoes would resonate across the wasteland for years to come. 6 months after the fall of Sanctuary Ridge, Dr. Elena Hartwell's research expedition crested the hill overlooking what had once been humanity's most successful settlement. The crater that marked its location was already being reclaimed by nature, green shoots pushing through the ash and debris with a patient determination of life reasserting itself over death. Satellite imagery shows the explosion occurred at dawn on September 22nd, reported her assistant, Marcus Chin, consulting the tablet that contained their accumulated intelligence. Thermal readings suggest the detonation consumed everything within a half-mile radius. No biological signatures detected for weeks afterward. Elena nodded grimly as she surveyed the devastation through binoculars. The renowned epidemiologist had spent the last year studying failed settlements, trying to understand why some communities survived while others fell to the endless hunger of the infected. Sanctuary Ridge represented her most important case study, a fortified position that should have been impregnable, defended by experienced survivors who had lasted 3 years against every threat the wasteland could produce. Her team of researchers moved carefully through the settlement's remains, their radiation detectors clicking steadily as they documented what they found. Personal effects scattered by the explosion told silent stories. A child's toy truck, half-melted but still recognizable. A wedding ring fused to a piece of concrete. A photograph of a family that had probably died in the early days of the outbreak. Found something, called Dr. Sarah Kim from the crater's eastern edge. The archaeologist specializing in post-outbreak sites held up a twisted piece of metal that had once been part of a sophisticated defensive system. Improvised explosive device probably rigged to motion sensors. The engineering work is remarkable for salvaged materials. Elena's team had been tracking the movements of what they had designated Horde Sigma 7, the massive group of infected that had been responsible for the settlement's destruction. Satellite data showed that over 3,000 undead had converged on Sanctuary Ridge from multiple directions, suggesting coordination that defied current understanding of infected behavior patterns. The attack patterns were unprecedented, Elena told her team as they established their base camp on the crater's rim. Individual infected show no sign of intelligence beyond basic hunger drives, but this horde demonstrated tactical thinking, adaptation to defensive strategies, and coordinated assault techniques. Something was controlling them. Marcus uploaded their preliminary findings to the secure network that connected the remaining research facilities scattered across the continent. The implications were disturbing. If the infected were developing collective intelligence, then every defensive strategy employed by survivor communities was potentially obsolete. As evening fell, Elena's team detected movement in the treeline surrounding the crater. Their motion sensors showed multiple heat signatures approaching their position, infected drawn by the warmth and sound of living humans. But these weren't the mindless shamblers they had expected. The approaching undead moved with purpose and coordination, spreading out to surround the research camp. "Pack everything," Elena ordered, her scientific curiosity overwhelmed by survival instinct. "We're leaving. Now." As they hastily broke camp, Elena caught sight of something that chilled her more than the approaching infected. Among the shambling figures, she recognized the tattered remains of military fatigues, hazmat suits, and civilian clothes that suggested these weren't random victims of the plague. These were the reanimated corpses of other research teams, scientists, and military personnel who had studied infected behavior. The escape from the crater was harrowing but successful, their vehicle climbing the access road as infected emerged from the forest behind them. In her rearview mirror, Elena watched the undead converge on their abandoned campsite with disturbing efficiency, immediately beginning to destroy the equipment they had left behind. "They're learning," she whispered to Marcus as they drove through the night toward the nearest safe zone. "Not just reacting to stimuli but actually learning from each encounter, processing information and adapting their strategies." 3 days later, Elena's preliminary report reached Dr. Amanda Torres at the Continental Research Facility, the most secure installation remaining in North America. The implications were staggering. If infected could learn and adapt, then humanity's defensive strategies needed complete revision. The old assumptions about mindless hunger driving the undead were dangerously obsolete. Deep in the facility's archives, Elena discovered references to Sanctuary Ridge in the final transmissions from other lost settlements. Clearwater Base had reported unusual coordination among attacking infected 2 weeks before its fall. Fort Harrison's last message mentioned tactical adaptation among the undead forces besieging their walls. New Geneva had transmitted warnings about infected using tools before their radio went silent. The pattern was clear but horrifying. The infected were evolving, developing collective intelligence through some mechanism that current science couldn't explain. Each failed settlement taught them new lessons about human defensive strategies, making them more effective against the next target. Elena's research team expanded to include military strategists, behavioral psychologists, and theoretical physicists, all working to understand the mechanism behind the infected's apparent evolution. Their preliminary theories ranged from quantum entanglement effects to viral-induced neural networking, but none could fully explain the observed phenomena. As autumn deepened into winter, reports arrived from survivor settlements across the continent describing increasingly sophisticated attacks by infected hordes. The undead were using decoy tactics, coordinated flanking maneuvers, and even primitive siege warfare techniques. The war between the living and the dead was evolving into something far more complex than simple survival. Elena often found herself thinking about the defenders of Sanctuary Ridge during those final, desperate hours. Caelan Thorne's decision to detonate the settlement rather than allow the children to be consumed had been both tragic and tactically sound. The explosion had eliminated a significant portion of Horde Sigma 7, potentially saving other settlements from attack. But the victory was temporary. Satellite tracking showed that scattered groups of infected from the original Horde had reformed and were moving toward other survivor communities. They carried with them the tactical knowledge gained from the siege of Sanctuary Ridge, making them more dangerous than any undead force previously encountered. In her final report on the Sanctuary Ridge incident, Elena wrote, "The defenders' sacrifice was not in vain. Their courage in the face of extinction provided crucial intelligence about infected evolution and tactical adaptation. While their settlement fell, their resistance taught us that humanity's survival depends not just on defensive preparations, but on our ability to evolve and adapt faster than our enemies." The crater where Sanctuary Ridge once stood remained silent under the winter snow, but its legacy lived on in the preparations being made by every surviving human community. The names of Caelan Thorne, Senna Brightwood, Darius Ashmont, Lyra Nightfall, Vesper Cross, and Ronan Steele were entered into the memorial database, ensuring that their sacrifice would be remembered by future generations of survivors. As spring returned to the wasteland, new growth emerged from the crater's ash-enriched soil. Life, in its infinite persistence, was reclaiming the battlefield where humanity had made its stand against extinction. The epic showdown between mindless walkers and smart survivors had ended in mutual destruction, but the war continued across 1,000 other battlefields where the living fought to preserve the future of their species. In the end, perhaps that was the true victory of Sanctuary Ridge, not that its defenders had survived, but that their sacrifice had meaning beyond their own lives, contributing to humanity's collective knowledge and strengthening the resolve of those who continued the fight against the darkness that had consumed the world.